I think if I was really focused on the negativity every day, I would burn out pretty fast. And so I have been able to sustain a career in food because for me, it is such a positive entry point into sustainability.
Hey, my name is Sabrina, and I am crazy passionate about healthy, sustainable living, and especially helping you figure out what sustainable health looks like in your life. I'm a yoga teacher and wellness coach, but not long ago, I was 50 pounds heavier, stressed out of my mind, and always sick. While I was majoring in environmental economics and policy in school, I figured out how to get healthy, cut my environmental footprint in half, and love my life. And I'm sharing with you just how to do that. We cover all elements of sustainable wellness here, from yoga, essential oils, waste streams, mindset hacks, self-care, and eating habits. I bring on badass women to chat about their health journeys and share their wisdom as business owners, thought leaders, and most importantly, everyday working gals. Think of this as your one-stop shop for sustainable living and wellness tips filled with inspiration and good vibes. So put in your headphones or turn up the volume and get ready to laugh and learn. You guys, I am so excited about this week's episode. This week, I got to sit down with Caroline Ferguson. Caroline and I met at 21 Acres while we were both working there. 21 Acres, for those of you that don't know, is a touch point for education about sustainable agriculture in Woodinville, Washington, where I live. I'm excited about this episode because Caroline is helping me kick off our discussion about sustainable eating habits here on the Stylish and Sustainable podcast. Today, we just break down the basics of sustainable eating, why it's important to think about planetary health when you put things in your mouth, and some really great ways to work around eating seasonal produce no matter where you live. Hi, Caroline. I am so excited to be sitting down and chatting with you. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. I am so excited to be diving into kind of an introduction, a 101, if you will, to sustainable eating. So before we dive into our tips and discussion about kind of what sustainable eating is to begin with, I would love to just hear about your experience in sustainable food.
Yeah. So I have always been into food my entire life. I've always, loved cooking. I started cooking when I was really a little kid. I don't come by it, honestly. I don't know why it always drew me in. My parents are not that into cooking or food. I just, for some reason, it was kind of what sparked my interest. But I didn't really ever know what I could do with that. Like, I didn't see a career in food that wasn't being a chef. And I sensed pretty early on that the traditional restaurant path wasn't really right for me. So I just kind of put that on the back burner for a while, went to college, actually studied education, and got really into writing and journalism in the time that I was in college. So I started writing for the school paper when I was a freshman and worked my way up. And through that path, sort of found out that food writing was a thing and that you could write about food without necessarily writing about restaurants or being like a restaurant reviewer. I think that's what people, that's the first thing they think about when you talk about food writing. But I sort of started using my position at the paper as an excuse to learn and write about food. And parlayed that into two different internships with Seattle Met Magazine, writing for their food and beverage department. So it just kind of ended up doing that throughout 4 years of college. And when I graduated, didn't really know what to make of that. And so took a couple months off of my life. I was really lucky to be able to go to France and woof for a summer. So I was working on a permaculture sheep farm as a volunteer farmer, which for me, since I'm not good at growing things, it's sort of the great irony of my life in food. I'm a terrible gardener. I mostly just ended up cooking for everybody, for the whole team. So I did that for a while, but eventually kind of figured out I needed to get a real bill paying job when I moved back to the States. And so I sort of on a lark got a job baking at a newly opened bakery on Capitol Hill in Seattle. So I kind of got thrown in the deep end by taking that job. We did classic French patisserie, so things like croissants and macarons and things like that, all completely by hand. The chef was classically trained and very methodical about the way that she wanted to make everything. And so I learned, a bunch of techniques just by kind of diving in headfirst into that. And there was a real focus on local and seasonal sourcing there. So I did that for a while, and then ended up getting a job with a company called Bon Appetit Management Company. They were actually the company that did the food service at my university. They have a 2-year-long sustainability fellowship, which is a position filled by 4 students around the country. And basically what you do in that role is it's sort of a 2-pronged role. So you travel around to universities around the country and you help support their sustainability programs and do guest lectures and things like that to educate students about food systems. And then the other half of that job is helping the company to craft its sustainability and sourcing policies. So basically, like, I was helping them to decide what they were going to source in their cafes and why. Did that for 2 years. And then I moved to wine country in California for a while. I got a job at a spot called Healdsburg Shed as their communications manager. And then eventually wanted to move home. I'm from the Pacific Northwest and couldn't really ignore the siren song of home. And so I ended up moving back to Washington and getting a job at a nonprofit in Woodinville, running their farm market program. It's called 21 Acres. Sabrina is well familiar with it. And it is focused around the mission of sustainable agriculture and food, but specifically soil health. They kind of zeroed in on that as the most impactful way to use their bandwidth as a nonprofit. So I currently work for them. I've been there for about a year, running their farm market program where we sell produce from our own farm and from lots of other local farms and ranches and producers. So yeah, that's my resume.
No, I love it. And okay, we're just going to pause and do a shameless shout out for 21 Acres. So Caroline and I met when I was working at 21 Acres. And if you live in the Seattle area, I know I have several listeners that are in the Pacific Northwest, especially in the Seattle area, know that 21 Acres is a fantastic touch point to get started learning about food in the context of sustainability. And that is located in Woodinville, but super accessible from pretty much all of the regions around the Seattle area. And you'll probably hear more about it in the future. So Caroline knows her ish about food in the context of sustainability, and that's a good thing. But my next question for you is, you know it, but what drives your passion for sustainable eating? What is the thing that keeps you ticking and has kept you pursuing this path into food set in the context of a larger environmental sustainable footprint?
Yeah. So as I said, I am really into food. I love to cook. I love to eat. I think food is really fun. It's something that we all share and that brings us pleasure and brings us connection. It's a really positive thing in my life. And I think in the lives of a lot of people. And the fact that my entry point was cooking, really has kind of shaped my career. I don't have any sort of formal background in sustainability or in environmental science. I did not take a single environmental science class in college. So everything really for me is kind of flowing out of my interest and enthusiasm in food. I think that is sort of what makes it possible for me to do this work. I am a really big picture person and I easily get overwhelmed. And I think about climate change a lot, as I think a lot of people of my generation, and hopefully just a lot of people in general, are pretty preoccupied with thoughts of climate change. And I think that I would have a hard time getting out of bed in the morning if I felt like I was doing nothing in my work. But at the same time, work around climate change really kind of drains me, and work that focuses on the kind of doom and gloom of, all the awfulness that is to come if we don't change course. I think if I was really focused on the negativity every day, I would burn out pretty fast. And so I have been able to sustain a career in food because for me, it is such a positive entry point into sustainability. It's, something that we do every day. Everybody eats every day, multiple times a day. And so that presents a lot of fresh starts and fresh opportunities to do better, which I think is really important. I think in a lot of ways, I'm not really the stereotypical sustainable eater. Like, I'm very imperfect. I eat everything. I am truly an omnivore. And I'm not very focused on being pure or perfect or getting it right 100% of the time. And I think in some ways that's I would like to think that makes me an effective educator and communicator, because I am not this perfect person up on a tower that someone is trying to be like. I just think that I'm someone who loves to eat and tries to do so thoughtfully and can kind of gently guide people as they try to do the same thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. There's two things that you said that I really want to emphasize and just kind of deconstruct. And I think the first thing is that, we talk a lot here at Stylish and Sustainable about the fact that the health of the planet also equals the health of you, and they feed into each other and they're completely interchangeable. And I think one of the reasons why I love to focus on that is not only because it's accessible, like everybody eats, everybody drinks, everybody walks and sleeps, but it's also hopeful. And like you said, nothing's going to get done except for Greta Thunberg, if we just all are sad all the time, like that doesn't motivate most people, is fear.
Right.
And I think that hope is a much better motivator. And you're so right about that. And I think that a lot of people will understand what you're saying there. And then the second thing I kind of wanted to deconstruct is, like we also talk a lot about, it's not effective to spread a movement if everybody looks really perfect, because nobody else wants to enter that movement. And I love that discussion. And that's a whole nother discussion and a whole nother day about eating habits in the context of sustainability and what is perfect and what is an exclusionary eating habit. But that's another podcast. So with all of those good things and us having a larger understanding now of who you are and what drives you, let's together just kind of take it back to basics. So some of the listeners are going to know this, and this is going to be totally like, oh my gosh, just sit here and listen for the next couple seconds. But for those of you that are just beginning to start your journey into sustainable eating, I want us to talk about 3 ways that conventional agriculture and factory farms are harming the environment. So Caroline, take it away.
Okay. So I think first on my mind, with just the work that I'm doing now, is the way that conventional agriculture depletes nutrients from the soil, with no long-term vision for replenishment. A lot of conventionally grown crops are very nutrient intensive. And so if you think about when a plant is growing, it takes nutrients out of the soil and uses them to grow. And so when you're growing the same plant over and over and over again on the same plot of land, you end up with soil that has no nutrients in it. It has no life. And so people tend to try and ameliorate that through, using, gosh, my brain just completely wiped clean. People try to ameliorate that by using fertilizers and sort of artificially regenerating the soil, instead of using organic practices like crop rotation, like cover cropping, like regenerative agriculture. So that's a really big one. Another one that is pretty obvious, and I think I would like to think that most people think of pretty often, is just the amount of emissions caused by every step of the process of producing food. Like anything else that is produced, it generates carbon. And, producing food is an incredible logistical task. And so you see carbon and methane being produced, while you're growing food, when you're harvesting food, transporting it, storing it, selling it. Eventually, when you waste food, that generates methane as well. So I think all of those emissions contribute to climate change, of course. And then another one is just the way in which intensive agriculture sort of inherently overtaxes natural resources. So two kind of main examples that I'd think of are deforestation to produce meat and overfishing. I think overfishing is a really big one and very pressing, and people often kind of forget about oceans when it comes to sustainable food production. But that is a major, major quandary facing the planet right now. So yeah, those are the first three things that come to mind, but there are a lot of different ways that we could go into it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. We're going to keep it basic this episode. So let's just build directly off of kind of the 3 points that you just laid out there. And you mentioned for your first one, kind of how, using nitrogen fixing crop rotations can help to draw down some carbon also, and to just contribute to future soil fertility. So we kind of took that one off the box. Let's talk about some major differences between conventional and sustainable agriculture when it comes to carbon footprint of the food that you're eating and anything else that you're thinking about. But I loved your last one, but I also kind of just wanted, there's a thought that I'm having about that. So dive into what the difference is.
Yeah. So I think generally when you talk about sustainable farming, it's a very broad umbrella term. And that's, I think, a challenge that the field is going to face over the next 10 years is that this is a term that anybody can kind of throw around. So when you talk about sustainable farming, that could mean anything from a corporate conventional farm that's maybe doing one thing right to a fully biodynamic, local, really small scale kind of agricultural operation. So it could mean anything, but at its best, I think sustainable agriculture, it does imply restoration of soil resources, growing with respect for natural ecosystems and processes. At its best, ideally down the road, sustainable agriculture can actually be a tool to actively restore ecosystems and not just kind of find that balance, through methods like regenerative agriculture, some specific methods like, shellfish production is a big one. You can actually use that as a tool to cleanse waterways. But in terms of the carbon footprint, one of the big ones that people tend to focus on is transportation of food. And certainly food miles and sort of eating local, that can be impactful. I think it's also really important not to lose the nuance of how different forms of transportation can be. A lot of food in a globalized agricultural system is air freighted, which means that they put it on planes and ship it around the world. And that has far and away the biggest carbon footprint of almost anything pertaining to food production. So trying to eat local, but specifically avoiding air freighted food whenever you can, is really important. I think also sustainable agriculture and just sort of sustainable food systems in general, there's been a really big focus on reducing food waste recently, which is really wonderful, really important. Something like 40% of the food that's produced in the United States every day goes to waste. And that is a concern not only because then all of the emissions that you produce throughout the process are also wasted, they were used unnecessarily. It's also important because the majority of that wasted food is thrown in a landfill. And when food is thrown in a landfill in an anaerobic environment, it produces methane, which is a really, really powerful greenhouse gas. And so that increased focus on food waste and on sort of the impact of food waste beyond what you might initially think of, I think is really positive and an important movement that's happening right now in sustainable agriculture. That's kind of what immediately comes to my mind, but I'd be curious to hear what you think.
Yeah, no, and you totally hit that on the head. I think that each part of what you talked about, from soil fertility to natural land degradation, which can be addressed, with permaculture and a whole bunch of different more thoughtful crop rotations. And then additionally, just paying more attention to what what food miles mean in the context of, the larger effort to reduce our carbon footprint, and also obviously set inside the context of your budget and what's available as an individual in today's society to support. It's a tricky balance, I think, trying to find all of it. But you're right. Those are the major differences. And we can dive into the science a whole nother day, and there is plenty of it. But I think what I would love to hear from you, you've explained you are passionate about food, and that passion for food drives your passion for sustainability. And so I think something that I have found a lot of hope and joy in is not only that eating healthy, locally sourced food is better for the environment, but there are some unexpected benefits that come from eating locally sourced, sustainably grown food. So I would just love to hear from you what you have found to be the flavor difference in food sourced from small local farms versus larger operations, even being conventional agriculture.
Yeah, so I think it depends quite a bit based on what kind of food it is. I certainly think there is, and I buy into the romantic notion that the flavor difference is really vast, and in some foods that is absolutely true. I am definitely that asshole who will not eat a tomato if it's not between like July and September. Because there's just absolutely no comparison. I don't buy strawberries out of season. There's certain things that I think the difference is just a wide chasm. I think, sometimes the comparison doesn't always hold up because big food is really good at producing things that we want to eat. So I think, it can't rest solely on that, but I do think that pretty reliably, especially when you're purchasing local, sustainably produced food tends to be fresher. It's getting to you more like sooner from when it was picked off of the farm. So, farmers are able to pick things when they're actually finished ripening and sort of at the peak of perfection. The other thing that I think really has an impact on the flavor difference is that small local farmers oftentimes have much more freedom to grow a wide variety of types of produce, of heirloom produce, things that are not really marketable in a grocery store, things that kind of go outside of the typical like romaine lettuce, bell pepper, red delicious apple, those kind of basic varietals that people will always want. Smaller farms are not beholden to those sorts of expectations that you'd have in a supermarket. And so they're able to grow really fun, interesting, delicious varietals that might otherwise get lost. And that is really important for the maintenance of biodiversity in our food system, and also for, just curious cooks like me who like to try new things that are delicious.
Yeah, I love that. I actually, usually when I'm typing these out, I'm thinking like, this is the answer I would give. I love that. I didn't think about that. That's very true. More variety. And it helps your brain grow, right? I think the other thing, if we're going to just really briefly look at, food is also a source of nutrition. And it's just been proven time and time again that the fresher the food, the more nutrient dense the food is. And I think that there's just a lot of value to not only, like you said, enjoying more variety, which also introduces a larger variety of nutrients and vitamins and minerals into your diet, but also it's fresher. You're getting, especially if it's harvested at its peak, instead of, like you mentioned earlier, harvested really early and then shipped for a long ass way. And It's gradually ripening off the vine. You're losing so many powerful, especially phytonutrients, which is something that so many Americans lack, and I just think there's so much value in that. It's exciting. It's good stuff. So we've established that we both like locally sourced, yummy, fresh, theoretically organic food. Also a discussion for another day. Dang. Okay. I'm making notes. So where do people find this stuff? I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of people sitting here thinking, well, this is all fine and dandy, but like my farmer's market closes in September. So what are your favorite ways to source high quality, let's stick to locally sourced, and then we can, if you want to dive off on a couple like larger global foods that you source that are organic, please do as well. But kind of what are your favorite ways to source high quality foods when the farmer's market isn't open?
That's a really good question. This is an area in which I really have to kind of check my privilege. I do my shopping under the unbelievable auspices of basically running a farmer's market that operates year round. So I have delicious, beautiful produce like falling in my lap several times a week that I get to take home and cook with. So I don't want to hold myself up as any sort of expert in finding food in an area where there is lack, because I have never experienced that. I live in Seattle. Even when I wasn't working at 21 Acres, I mean, I am surrounded by lots and lots of grocery stores that make it pretty easy to find local organic food. I did find when I was traveling a lot for the fellowship that I was very surprised by the proliferation of farmers markets in places that, and oftentimes year-round farmers markets in places where you wouldn't expect to see them. And I think that that is a really important resource to take advantage of whenever it's available to you. Farmers at farmers markets know more than any of us mere mortals about how to get good food consistently year round. I think that also oftentimes farmers are producing food that's not limited to sort of the summer season. Like you can buy things at a farmer's market and you can freeze them or you can dry them. Oftentimes farmers are already producing dried food, frozen food, things to kind of see you through the season. So definitely you have to kind of strike while the iron is hot whenever the farmer's market is actually open, but you'd be surprised at what a good resource they can be in terms of feeding yourself year round. I think it's really important, above all in this department, it's really important to learn just the basics of how to cook. This is kind of the drum that I'm always beating when I'm talking to people about sustainable eating. When you're buying food from a farm, it's not going to come pre-chopped and pre-packaged and peeled and roasted. And, it's not going to, that won't all be done for you. Usually you'll be buying something that looks a little more intimidating, like a whole celery root or whatever. And you do not have to be some kind of gourmet chef. Just learning a few basics of how to break down produce that's more in its raw state, I think is really important and will open up kind of a whole new world of local food to you. I think that in general, as much as we can talk about sort of personal habits, much of the onus in this conversation is on corporations to change their practices. And there are a lot of corporations that benefit and profit when we don't know how to feed ourselves. And so I think that's really kind of a cornerstone of my food philosophy. I also think, just to be totally honest, I buy most of my produce locally, and I have really adjusted to reduced availability at certain times of year. I think that we sort of have this mindset, I want to say an American mindset, but I also think it's just kind of modern day life probably everywhere, that we want what we want to be available whenever we want it. And that is not naturally how the food system operates. I think that people, the world cannot provide to us in January as it can in August. And I think kind of adjusting our eating habits around that is really important. And at the same time, again, I don't want to hold myself up to be a paragon of perfection of local sourcing. I think I like to have fun with food and I like to shop everywhere. It won't do anything good for the world if you're burnt out and tied up in pursuing perfection. And so, I try to do most of my shopping at local co-ops and at farmers markets, but I shop everywhere. I shop at the supermarket. I shop at Whole Foods. I shop at convenience stores. I shop at my local Japanese market. And I really try to have fun with sort of gaining food literacy. Like when I'm shopping, I try to pay attention. I try to see what's going on around me, who's in the store, who's not in the store, read labels, kind of figure out what do I like from where, what's available where, and kind of take up the mantle of improving my food literacy in a way that just feels kind of fun and enriching and expansive.
I love that. That's great. Food literacy has to be fun, or else people are just, I mean, except for foodies, are not, there's just like, there's no buy-in. And I also really love your prepping idea. And I think that that's also, there's a lot of value to the idea of just planning ahead, getting it when the iron is hot and getting the good stuff and then prepping accordingly. And I'll just give a shameless plug here that Stylish and Sustainable does have a YouTube series that we just started on prepping and dealing with seasonal produce. And, I think you're also right about it. Having a more seasonally based mindset is really key. And I mean, I will admit, I eat avocados all year round, but after a while, I think once you start to get more attuned to what high quality produce looks like and tastes like, which also I will say it's important to know that high quality produce doesn't always mean high value price tag, right? It can mean bartering with a neighbor or growing your own garden, but knowing the value of having in-season fruits and vegetables, you'll start to notice. It's just like any other habit. And I think there's also something to be said for like bodily cravings, like there's a reason why we want potatoes in the wintertime. They're seasonal. If you're living in North America, for the most part, there's a lot of folks that will crave squash around Thanksgiving. And some of this is marketing. I will give that. But there's something to be said for craving warm, mushy food in the wintertime. And part of that is because that's your body instinctually knows this is what's in season. And then you want the fresh citrus and all of the delicious stone fruit in the summertime because that's what your body knows. And it's just about listening to that. I would say the only thing that I thought about, and this is not for folks in like urban food deserts, of course, is also like a CSA. And I would love to have you just explain what a CSA is to listeners.
Yeah, so CSA stands for Community Supported Agriculture, and it basically means that you pay a flat fee to a farmer to either deliver you or you pick up a box of their produce every week or every month or every other week or however often. But basically the benefit of that for the farmer is that they know they're going to have a consistent amount of income coming in, and it helps to kind of provide a buffer so that, the natural risks of farming are sort of ameliorated. So, if they have crop failure, if they have a bumper crop and end up with, much, much more than they're able to sell, they kind of have this built-in client base that usually gets a little bit of a discount off of the prices that they would be paying at the farmer's market in exchange for sharing a little bit of the risk of the farm that's sort of disproportionately shouldered by the farmer.
Yeah. And I think it's a great way. I've heard a lot of folks talk about how much value they find in the community too, of being a part of a CSA. It's kind of like being a part of a really special club where you're eating food from the same ground as your neighbor and your farmer. And there's just so much juicy love and warmth that comes from being a part of a community like that.
Yeah. I've never been part of a CSA. I'm like a weirdo who loves to grocery shop. And I am very cravings driven in how I shop. Like I want to eat what I want to eat that day. So I've never actually signed up for one, but I have a lot of friends who don't run farmers markets that have, and that really, really love it.
Yeah. So if you're in an area that's near a agricultural hub, it's interesting to look into, and don't judge from what it looks like, because I've heard that there are also several different urban CSAs. There's a couple in New York. I think there's maybe 2 or 3 in Los Angeles where folks are growing in places you wouldn't expect. Backyard, then community gardens, and then, culminating it together and using a CSA system to help run the garden or whatever that may be. So fun to Google and check out. Okay, we covered a lot. There's a lot to unpack for everyone that's listening, but it's good stuff. And we're going to be diving into food in the context of sustainability a lot more here at SNS in the next coming weeks, which is very exciting. But it's been really fun to chat with you, Caroline.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Love talking about food.
So much great information and such a joy to chat with Caroline about sustainable eating habits. I'm so excited to be diving into this topic for a little while here on the SNS podcast. For those of you that are thinking, my health is definitely at a place where there are some areas for growth, don't worry, I have lots of tools for you. The first thing is be sure to head to the link in the show description for the free downloadable health map. As a health and stress reduction coach, I have created this map to help you figure out where exactly your areas for growth are and your first steps to achieving those goals. If you're thinking, I really could use some extra help achieving my health goals and learning about how to eliminate toxins from my life or manage my stress or even lose weight, go ahead and book a free health consultation with me at the website. Again, also in the show notes, livestylishandsustainable.com. Be sure to check in with all of the daily content on the Instagram account at stylishandsustainable. Can't wait to sit down with you next week. Sending good vibes your way.